Welcome to part 4 of Prelude to the Revolution. Now we're going to take a look at the Boston Massacre. So the Stamp Act is repealed, right? But we still have this issue of raising revenue. And Parliament now is getting a little bit fed up with these colonists and their attitudes. Matter of fact, right after repealing the Stamp Acts, Parliament is going to issue what is called the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act states that the Parliament has the right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So in other words, Parliament's basically saying, hey, look, you guys, we do represent you. We have the right to tax you, and you better get yourself right with that. In 1767, a member of Parliament named Charles Townsend is going to put this to the test when he introduces a whole new round of taxes called the Townsend Acts. Right? The Townsend Acts are going to be a new set of taxes requiring colonists to pay an import duty on tea, glass, paints, oil, lead, and paper. All right, these items, which are items that were in common use, right? Okay, but additionally, it also has provisions in it to allow for the enforcement of these taxes. One of the things this tax is going to be used is to pay the royal governors in the colonies. You see, the colonists up to this point, it was the colonial legislatures that had been paying the royal governors. Right, so you have the local legislatures that's raising revenue to pay the paycheck for the royal governor. Now, the problem that Townsend saw with that was that it allowed that these colonial legislatures to actually have leverage that they could put against the royal governor. The royal governor is just trying to enact the acts of the king, and the colonial legislature suddenly loses his paycheck, right? Well, now you don't have to worry about it. The Townsend Act, the money collected, is going to be administered by a American Board of Custom Commissioners that will be sent to enforce the tax, and they will pay the governors directly, thus removing that power from the colonial legislatures, right? Now, the colonial reaction to this, again, is going to be extreme. You're going to have a whole nother wave of non-importation agreements and another whole new wave of violence and rioting, right? On August 1st, 1768, Boston is going to adopt a ordinance called the Boston Non-Importation Agreement. The Boston Non-Importation Agreement included an embargo on the import or export to Great Britain of all goods, especially those that are subject to the new Townsend duties, right? And the violence, well, I mean, we got a whole new series of tarring and feathering of tax collectors. And by this point, King George III has had enough, right? He's fed up with Boston, especially being the hotbed of this anti-parliamentarianism. And matter of fact, in King George III's mind, and we'll see this all the way through the American Revolution, Boston is the problem. If he can get Boston under control, the rest of the colonies will all fall into line. So on October 1st, 1768, King George III sends troops to be permanently stationed in the city of Boston, right? Which, of course, is going to lead to a disaster. Well, the first question then we have to ask, you got all these troops going to Boston, is where are you going to put them? Well, it seems like that question had been answered by a law that had been passed 3 years prior. It was called the Quartering Act of 1765, right? Now, the Quartering Act required colonies to provide barracks to British troops that were stationed in their region, okay? And if there were not enough barracks or to house them, then they had to find other kinds of accommodations. Now, to be clear, this did not mean that soldiers could just randomly take over people's houses. A matter of fact, there was a provision in the 1765 law that said that if a British officer forcibly took over someone else's home, his punishment was to be decommissioned. He would be kicked out of the force. So that is something that was not part of the Quartering Act of 1765 or the other Quartering Act that will follow. But boy, it sure did have a heck of an effect on the colonists, because it was perceived that that's exactly what they could do. Matter of fact, so much so, if you're familiar with the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, you know that the Third Amendment specifically says no housing of troops in people's homes. They can't take over your homes, right? But at any rate, the Quartering Act did say that you had to put them up in empty barns, in livery stables, in ale houses, warehouses, whatever you could find, right? So these troops there are now stationed in Boston. And like I said, there's a lot of tension. Boston is ground zero for this anti-parliamentarian, anti-king sentiment. Okay? And so in 1770, on March 5th, things finally come to a head. Now, some of this was driven with some animosity was developing between the townspeople of Boston and the soldiers themselves. See, one of the things the soldiers were doing was when they were off duty, they're getting paid, for being there, right? But when they're off duty, they're bored. So they were going around Boston and picking up any of the odd jobs around there. Now, the Boston economy was such that most people, their primary job didn't really pay all the bills, and so you made ends meet by doing little odd jobs. So-and-so needs a fence painted or what have you. Well, now these soldiers are taking all of these jobs away, and they're just doing it just so they can get extra ale money, right? And so there's a lot of tension already. So on March 5th, 1770, an argument broke out between a soldier and a local area merchant early in the day. An argument that was finally settled with the butt of the soldier's rifle. He basically said, "I'm right," and clocked him in the head with the rifle. So there's already a lot of anger in the air on the 5th. And on that day, then, a group of people from the fishing docks began to descend upon the custom house on King Street. The custom house on King Street was guarded by a lone British soldier, one sentry, just standing there, right, guarding the door to the custom house. This is where all the taxation is handled, right? And you got this angry mob that starts to form around them. And like I said, most of these guys are coming from the wharfs, right? They're fishermen, and so they're brandishing. They got these, they look like billy clubs, right, for beating out fishing nets and stuff like that. They have those. They're throwing snowballs and oyster shells and even stones and chunks of ice, right? The sentry's getting more and more nervous as he's being pelted by these items, right? More people begin to arrive, especially when somebody begins ringing the church bells, which was a common thing to do to alert people in the town when there was a fire, right? That was the way you did it. You didn't have, sirens or anything like that. So more and more people descended, and as a result, Captain Thomas Preston is going to send a regiment of soldiers to protect this poor lone sentry from this angry mob. So they're going to encircle the sentry and the custom house and try and get this crowd to disperse, right? So things are escalating. You got this angry mob that keeps growing in size. You had this regiment of infantry surrounding this custom house and this poor sentry. Insults being shouted back and forth. And finally, at some point, Private Hugh Montgomery was struck in the head by one of those wooden clubs. Somebody had thrown it and it hit him. And around that same time, someone, no one knows who, yelled, "Fire." And the soldiers leveled a volley on the crowd. The first person struck and killed was a man named Crispus Attucks. Crispus Attucks was an escaped slave. He also went by the name Michael Johnson. He was struck and killed, right? 4 other people would be struck as well. 2 of them would hold on for a while, but ultimately you would have 5 people die in this melee. Now, one thing that's interesting about this is you have 5 killed in this single volley. Captain Preston very quickly gets his men to stand down, and the court hearings later will determine that he was not the man that yelled fire, right? That he had never done that. But 5 people dead, and yet we call it a massacre. Is that really a massacre? I mean, let's think about this for a second. What is really the definition of a massacre? I mean, I guess it depends on your opinion, but to me it seems a lot more than 5. When I think massacre, I think of the Mandalay Bay shooting at the minimum. I'm thinking Tiananmen Square, things like that. I'm not thinking 5 people killed in a single, very quick skirmish between British soldiers and British citizens, right? So where does this idea of massacre come from? Well, it comes from Sons of Liberty Samuel Adams and Paul Revere. In fact, Paul Revere is going to be the first one to use that word massacre, right? He's going to produce this pamphlet you see here, in which it says, "The Bloody Massacre, perpetrated on King Street and J Street, Boston on March 5th by a party of the 29th Regiment," right? So it's very inflammatory. Matter of fact, there is a ton of propaganda value in this poster. And I mean, I love symbolism and I love seeing stuff like this. It kind of really gets me. When I look at this poster, there's a lot of propaganda value in it. First of all, let's take a look at the soldiers. You notice how they're not surrounding some lone sentry in front of a custom house. They're actually set up in a formal skirmishing line, like they were lined up for combat. And there's old Captain Preston in the background, sword raised, giving the command to fire. And look at the crowd that's surrounding them there, the guys there on the left. Does that look like an angry mob of fishermen carrying billy clubs and throwing snowballs? Or does that look like a bunch of English gentlemen about ready to head towards Sunday church? All of them unarmed, of course, and all of them pleading for, see the one guy's got his hand up, like, please don't shoot. And, oh, hey, where's Crispus Attucks in all this? He doesn't even make it on the poster, all right? A lot of propaganda value here. Now, like I said, initially, Paul Revere is going to call this the Bloody Massacre, but by 1773, in order for this to be a colony-wide call to arms, they'll begin calling it the Boston Massacre so people can get a feel for where this actually took place.